Hey sleepy friends, welcome back to Sleepy Science. Tonight we start with a sound you know well, a notification. Not the chime of a modern phone, but something that would have been impossible in the year 100 CE. A soft vibration. A glowing screen. A message appears in Latin script, translated from Greek, sent from a legion commander stationed in Britannia. The message reads, "Enemy forces spotted, requesting orders." It arrived in 3 seconds. In the real world, that same message would have taken weeks to travel by courier across the Roman road network, even at its peak efficiency. The year is 100 CE. The Roman Empire stretches from the Atlantic to the Euphrates, from the Rhine to the Sahara. It is the largest, most sophisticated state the world has yet seen. Its roads span over 80,000 kilometers. Its aqueducts deliver millions of liters of water daily. Its legal system influences law to this day. But information moves at the speed of a horse, a ship, or a human runner. Tonight we ask what happens when that changes. What if every Roman citizen, from senators to slaves, from legionaries to merchants, suddenly had access to a smartphone? Scientists and historians have spent decades reconstructing how information flowed in the ancient world. Archaeologists study the remains of Roman postal stations, called cursus publicus, where couriers changed horses and rested. Epigraphers read thousands of inscriptions carved into stone, the closest thing Rome had to public databases. Papyrologists pieced together private letters preserved in Egyptian sands, revealing how families maintained connections across vast distances. All of this evidence points to one truth: communication was slow, expensive, and limited to the elite. But what if that bottleneck vanished? What if a Roman general could coordinate 3 legions in real time? What if a merchant in Alexandria could check grain prices in Rome instantly? What if a slave could organize with others across provinces? What if a senator could live stream a speech to citizens in Gaul, Hispania, and Syria simultaneously? For the next 2 hours we will explore this thought experiment with the rigor of both ancient history and modern information science. When we describe how smartphones would function in ancient Rome, we ground each claim in archaeological evidence, engineering principles, and social theory. We will examine power generation, network architecture, data storage, and user interfaces. We will trace how instant communication would reshape military strategy, economic markets, political power, and social structures. Where the evidence is uncertain, we will say so. Where multiple outcomes are possible, we will explore them all. So the notification has arrived. The screen glows in the dim light of an oil lamp. A message from Britannia sits in a senator's hand, delivered faster than any courier could dream. Around this moment, a team of experts waits. Historians who understand Roman society, engineers who design modern networks, sociologists who study how technology transforms culture, and philosophers who question whether faster always means better. No one rushes. Instead, they measure, analyze, and debate. The experiment has begun. Full episode script. Hey sleepy friends, welcome back to Sleepy Science. A notification buzzes. Not from your phone. This one glows in the dim light of an oil lamp, in a room that has never seen electricity. The year is 100 CE. A Roman senator holds a device that should not exist. The screen shows a message in Latin. It came from a legion commander in Britannia, over 200 miles away. The message arrived in 3 seconds. In the real world, that same message would take 24 days. Archaeologists have studied the Roman postal system for decades. They found stations called mutationes every 10 miles along major roads. Couriers changed horses at each station. Under perfect conditions, messages traveled about 50 miles per day. From Rome to Britannia, that is almost a month of riding. But tonight we imagine something different. What if smartphones existed in ancient Rome? What if every citizen, from senators to slaves, suddenly had access to instant communication? The Roman Empire was massive. It stretched from the Atlantic to the Euphrates, from the Rhine to the Sahara. Historians estimate the empire covered about 5 million square kilometers. That is roughly the size of the United States. Over 80,000 kilometers of roads connected this vast territory. Aqueducts delivered millions of liters of water daily. The legal system still influences law today. Yet information moved slowly, at the speed of a horse, or a ship, or a human runner. Epigraphers have read thousands of stone inscriptions. These were Rome's closest thing to public databases. Papyrologists found private letters preserved in Egyptian sands. Families maintained connections across vast distances. But it took months. Communication was slow, expensive, and limited to the elite. Archaeologists discovered something interesting. The cursus publicus, the imperial postal system, had strict rules. Only government officials could use it. Private citizens could not. Even officials needed permission. The system was tightly controlled. This tells us something important. Information was power. And power was restricted. But what if that changed? What if a general could coordinate 3 legions in real time? What if a merchant in Alexandria could check grain prices in Rome instantly? What if a slave could organize with others across provinces? What if a senator could speak to citizens in Gaul, Hispania, and Syria simultaneously? For the next 2 hours we explore this thought experiment. We ground each claim in archaeological evidence. We use engineering principles. We apply social theory. We examine power generation, network architecture, data storage, and user interfaces. We trace how instant communication would reshape military strategy, economic markets, political power, and social structures. Where evidence is uncertain, we say so. Where multiple outcomes are possible, we explore them all. The notification has arrived. The screen glows. A message from Britannia sits in a senator's hand. Delivered faster than any courier could dream. Around this moment, experts wait, historians who understand Roman society, engineers who design modern networks, sociologists who study how technology transforms culture. They measure, analyze, and debate. The experiment has begun. A portal opens. Millions of smartphones appear across the empire. They come with charging cables, solar panels, and instruction manuals translated into Latin and Greek. This scenario lets us focus on the impact, not the invention process. We want to see what happens when the technology exists, not how it gets built. The first challenge is power. Smartphones need electricity to work. Ancient Rome had no power grids, no electrical outlets, no batteries like we know them today. So how would Romans charge their phones? The phones that arrive come with solar charging panels. These are thin, flexible sheets that capture sunlight. In ancient Rome, the Mediterranean sun shines bright most of the year. A phone left in the sun for a few hours could charge enough for a day of use. But what about cloudy days? What about night? Some phones might come with hand crank chargers. You turn a handle, and it generates electricity. It is like winding a watch but bigger. Roman engineers, who already built complex machines like water wheels and siege engines, could probably figure out how to improve these cranks. They might build larger versions powered by water wheels or even slaves turning handles. Not ideal, but it would work. Battery technology is trickier. Modern lithium batteries are complex. They require rare materials and precise manufacturing. In ancient Rome, these would be impossible to replace. So the phones that arrive would need to last. Maybe they come with extra batteries. Maybe they are built to be more durable than modern phones. For our story, we will assume each phone has enough battery capacity to last years if cared for properly. The biggest challenge is networks. Your phone needs to connect to other phones. In our world, this happens through cell towers and satellites. Ancient Rome has neither. So how would phones communicate? This is where mesh networks come in. A mesh network is like a chain of phones. Phone A talks to phone B. Phone B talks to phone C. Messages hop from phone to phone until they reach their destination. If you want to send a message from Rome to Britannia, it might hop through hundreds of phones along the way. Each phone acts like a tiny relay station. But there is a problem. What if there are gaps? What if no phones exist in a certain area? Messages would get stuck. To solve this, the empire would need to place relay phones at regular intervals. Maybe at every major road station. Maybe at every city. The Roman road network, which already had rest stops every few miles, would be perfect for this. Rome already had infrastructure for information. They had the cursus publicus, the imperial postal system. This was a network of stations where couriers could rest, change horses, and pass messages. The stations were placed about every 10 miles along major roads. Sound familiar? It is almost like ancient cell towers, just slower. If smartphones arrived, Rome could use these existing stations as relay points. Each station gets a phone. Messages hop from station to station, following the same routes couriers used. But instead of taking weeks, messages arrive in minutes. The infrastructure is already there. The technology just makes it faster. What about satellites? Modern phones often use satellites for GPS and some communication. Could Rome launch satellites? Probably not. Rocket technology did not exist. But they might not need satellites. The mesh network could handle most communication. For location, phones could use landmarks and maps stored in memory. Not as precise as GPS, but good enough for navigation. Data storage is another challenge. Modern phones store huge amounts of information. Photos, videos, apps, all of this takes space. In ancient Rome, there would be no cloud storage, no internet to download more apps. Each phone would need to be self-contained. Maybe they come pre-loaded with useful information. Maps of the empire, translation dictionaries, medical guides, engineering manuals. Phones could share information directly, like passing a book to a friend, but digitally. You could beam an app or a document to someone nearby. This is called peer-to-peer sharing. It does not need the internet. It just needs two phones close together. This way, knowledge could spread across the empire, phone to phone, person to person. Language is another challenge. The Roman Empire spoke many languages. Latin was the official language. Greek was common in the East. Local languages existed everywhere. Smartphones would need to handle all of these. Maybe they come with translation software. Maybe users learn to use them in their own language. This would be a huge advantage. For the first time, a Gaul and a Greek could communicate directly, even if they did not share a common language. Who gets phones? In our scenario, millions appear across the empire. But who actually receives them? Senators? Soldiers? Merchants? Slaves? This matters because it changes everything. If only the elite get phones, power stays concentrated. If everyone gets phones, power spreads. For our story, we will assume phones appear somewhat randomly. Some senators get them, some soldiers get them, some merchants get them, some slaves get them. Not everyone, but enough people from every social class that the technology spreads. This creates the most interesting scenario. It lets us see how different groups would use the technology differently. Literacy presents a problem. Not everyone in ancient Rome could read. Estimates suggest maybe 20 to 30% of the population was literate. Smartphones with text-based interfaces would be useless to illiterate users. So the phones would need voice interfaces, or picture-based interfaces, or they would need to teach people to read, which would be revolutionary in itself. Durability is another challenge. Ancient Rome was rough. Dust, rain, heat, cold. Phones would need to be tough. Maybe they come in protective cases. Maybe they are built stronger than modern phones. Engineers would need to design for a world without repair shops, without replacement parts, without technical support. Security is a major concern. In our world, we worry about hackers. In ancient Rome, the concern would be spies and enemies. What if enemies captured phones? What if rebels used them? The empire would need ways to encrypt messages, to verify identities, to prevent misuse. This is not just a technical problem. It is a social and political problem. The first big challenge is power. Your smartphone needs electricity to work. Ancient Rome had no power grids, no electrical outlets, no batteries like we know them today. So how would Romans charge their phones? Engineers have thought about this. The phones that arrive come with solar charging panels. These are thin, flexible sheets that capture sunlight. In ancient Rome, the Mediterranean sun shines bright most of the year. A phone left in the sun for a few hours could charge enough for a day of use. But what about cloudy days? What about night? Some phones might come with hand-crank chargers. You turn a handle, and it generates electricity. It is like winding a watch, but bigger. Roman engineers, who already built complex machines like water wheels and siege engines, could probably figure out how to improve these cranks. They might build larger versions powered by water wheels, or even slaves turning handles. Not ideal, but it would work. Battery technology is trickier. Modern lithium batteries are complex. They require rare materials and precise manufacturing. In ancient Rome, these would be impossible to replace. So the phones that arrive would need to last. Maybe they come with extra batteries. Maybe they are built to be more durable than modern phones. For our story, we will assume each phone has enough battery capacity to last years if cared for properly. Now, the biggest challenge: networks. Your phone needs to connect to other phones. In our world, this happens through cell towers and satellites. Ancient Rome has neither. So how would phones communicate? This is where mesh networks come in. A mesh network is like a chain of phones. Phone A talks to phone B. Phone B talks to phone C. Messages hop from phone to phone until they reach their destination. If you want to send a message from Rome to Britannia, it might hop through hundreds of phones along the way. Each phone acts like a tiny relay station. But there is a problem. What if there are gaps? What if no phones exist in a certain area? Messages would get stuck. To solve this, the empire would need to place relay phones at regular intervals. Maybe at every major road station. Maybe at every city. The Roman road network, which already had rest stops every few miles, would be perfect for this. Engineers call this infrastructure. Infrastructure means the basic systems that make technology work. Roads, bridges, water pipes, these are all infrastructure. For smartphones to work across the empire, Rome would need communication infrastructure. relay stations, charging stations, maybe even repair shops. Rome already had infrastructure for information. They had the cursus publicus, the imperial postal system. This was a network of stations where couriers could rest, change horses and pass messages. The stations were placed about every 10 miles along major roads. Sound familiar? It is almost like ancient cell towers, just slower. If smartphones arrived, Rome could use these existing stations as relay points. Each station gets a phone. Messages hop from station to station, following the same routes couriers used. But instead of taking weeks, messages arrive in minutes. The infrastructure is already there. The technology just makes it faster. What about satellites? Modern phones often use satellites for GPS and some communication. Could Rome launch satellites? Probably not. Rocket technology did not exist. But they might not need satellites. The mesh network could handle most communication. For location, phones could use landmarks and maps stored in memory. Not as precise as GPS, but good enough for navigation. Data storage is another challenge. Modern phones store huge amounts of information. Photos, videos, apps, all of this takes space. In ancient Rome, there would be no cloud storage, no internet to download more apps. Each phone would need to be self-contained. Maybe they come pre-loaded with useful information, maps of the empire, translation dictionaries, medical guides, engineering manuals. Phones could share information directly, like passing a book to a friend, but digitally. You could beam an app or a document to someone nearby. This is called peer-to-peer sharing. It does not need the internet. It just needs two phones close together. This way, knowledge could spread across the empire, phone to phone, person to person. Language is another challenge. The Roman Empire spoke many languages. Latin was the official language. Greek was common in the East. Local languages existed everywhere. Smartphones would need to handle all of these. Maybe they come with translation software. Maybe users learn to use them in their own language. This would be a huge advantage. For the first time, a Gaul and a Greek could communicate directly, even if they did not share a common language. Who gets phones? In our scenario, millions appear across the empire. But who actually receives them? Senators, soldiers, merchants, slaves. This matters because it changes everything. If only the elite get phones, power stays concentrated. If everyone gets phones, power spreads. For our story, we will assume phones appear somewhat randomly. Some senators get them, some soldiers get them, some merchants get them, some slaves get them. Not everyone, but enough people from every social class that the technology spreads. This creates the most interesting scenario. It lets us see how different groups would use the technology differently. Literacy presents a problem. Not everyone in ancient Rome could read. Estimates suggest maybe 20 to 30% of the population was literate. Smartphones with text-based interfaces would be useless to illiterate users, so the phones would need voice interfaces. Or picture-based interfaces. Or they would need to teach people to read, which would be revolutionary in itself. Durability matters. Ancient Rome was rough. Dust, rain, heat, cold. Phones would need to be tough. Maybe they come in protective cases. Maybe they are built stronger than modern phones. Engineers would need to design for a world without repair shops, without replacement parts, without technical support. One more thing. Security. In our world, we worry about hackers and data breaches. In ancient Rome, the concern would be different. What if enemies captured phones? What if spies used them? The empire would need ways to encrypt messages, to verify identities, to prevent misuse. This is not just a technical problem. It is a social and political problem. Smartphones arrive through a portal. They come with solar chargers and hand cranks. They use mesh networks to communicate, hopping from phone to phone. They rely on existing Roman infrastructure like road stations. They are durable, multilingual, and accessible to people across social classes. They can share information peer-to-peer. And they raise questions about security, literacy, and power. Understanding what Rome was like before smartphones matters. What was the information landscape? How did people communicate? Only by knowing the before can we truly appreciate the after. Imagine you are a Roman citizen living in the year 100 CE. You want to send a message to your brother who lives in Gaul, hundreds of miles away. How do you do it? You have a few options, and none of them are fast. You could write a letter, you find a scribe, or if you are literate you write it yourself, you roll it up into a scroll, then you need to get it delivered. If you are wealthy, you might hire a private courier. This costs money, a lot of money. If you are not wealthy, you might wait for a merchant heading that direction. You give them your letter, and hope they remember to deliver it. This could take weeks or months. Your letter might get lost. It might arrive after your brother has moved. There is no guarantee. You could travel yourself. You pack your bags, get on a horse or in a cart, and ride for days or weeks. This is expensive, dangerous, and time-consuming. Most people never traveled more than a few miles from home in their entire lives. You could try to use the imperial postal system that Cursus Publicus. But here is the catch. This system is only for official government messages. You cannot use it for personal letters. It is reserved for the emperor, senators, and military commanders. Even if you are a government official, you need permission. The system is tightly controlled. So how did the Cursus Publicus actually work? Follow a real message. The emperor in Rome wants to send orders to a general in Britannia. The message is written on a scroll. It is given to a courier, a special messenger called a tabularius. The courier mounts a horse and rides to the first station, about 10 miles away. There, he exchanges his tired horse for a fresh one. He might rest briefly, then continue. At the next station he does the same thing. Horse after horse, station after station, he rides day and night. How fast could this be? Under perfect conditions, with good weather and fresh horses waiting at every station, a message could travel about 50 miles per day. From Rome to Britannia, that is roughly 200 miles, so the message would take about 24 days to arrive. That is almost a month. And that is the fastest possible speed, using the best imperial system. For comparison, a modern text message travels that distance in less than a second. A phone call connects instantly. The difference is staggering. But to Romans, this speed was normal. They had no concept of instant communication. They planned for delays. They wrote letters knowing replies would take months. They made decisions knowing they could not check with superiors first. What about information that was not written? What about news? How did Romans learn about events happening far away? Most news traveled by word of mouth. Travelers, merchants, and soldiers brought stories with them. When a merchant arrived in town, people would gather to hear news from other places. Did you hear about the battle in Dacia? What is the price of grain in Alexandria? Is the emperor planning to visit? These conversations happened in marketplaces, taverns, and public squares. Archaeologists have found evidence of this in ancient graffiti. In Pompeii, walls are covered with messages. People wrote about gladiator fights, political events, and local gossip. These were the social media of ancient Rome. But they were local. A message in Pompeii stayed in Pompeii. It did not travel to Rome or Gaul. Word of mouth is unreliable. Stories change as they pass from person to person. Details get lost. New details get added. By the time news reached a distant province, it might be completely wrong. There was no way to verify information. No fact-checking. No official news sources. At least not for most people. Historians call this the telephone game effect. A story starts in Rome. By the time it reaches Britannia, it has changed completely. A small battle becomes a massive war. A minor tax increase becomes a complete economic collapse. The further information traveled, the less accurate it became. The government did try to share official news. They carved announcements into stone and placed them in public squares. These inscriptions, called edicts, told people about new laws, military victories, and imperial decrees. But these were permanent. Once carved, they could not be updated, and most people could not read them anyway. Literacy was limited. For those who could read, there were books. But books in ancient Rome were expensive. They were handwritten on papyrus or parchment. A single book might cost as much as a month's wages for a laborer. Libraries existed, but they were rare, and usually private. The public library in Rome, built by Emperor Trajan, was a marvel precisely because it was unusual. Archaeologists have found evidence of private libraries in wealthy homes. These collections were small, maybe a few dozen scrolls. They were status symbols. Owning books showed you were educated and wealthy. But most people never saw the inside of a library. Most people never owned a book. Knowledge was locked away, accessible only to the elite. Papyrologists have discovered something interesting. In Egypt, where the dry climate preserved documents, they found thousands of private letters. These letters reveal how families stayed connected across vast distances. A soldier writes to his mother. A merchant writes to his business partner. But these letters took months to arrive. By the time a mother received news of her son's promotion, he might have already moved to a different province. Information was also stored in people's memories. Oral tradition was strong. Stories, laws, histories, all passed down through speech. Elders taught the young. Bards sang epic poems. This worked, but it was fragile. If a person died, their knowledge might be lost forever. There was no backup. No way to preserve information except through other people remembering it. Historians estimate that most of what we know about early Roman history comes from later writers who recorded oral traditions. Livy, writing in the 1st century BCE, based much of his history on stories passed down for generations. How accurate were these stories? We cannot know. Details changed with each telling. Heroes became more heroic, battles became more dramatic, the truth became mixed with legend. This fragility affected everything. A doctor's knowledge died with the doctor, unless they taught it to someone else. A craftsman's techniques disappeared, if no apprentice learned them. A general's strategies were lost if no one wrote them down. Knowledge was personal, temporary, and easily lost. How did the Roman Empire manage to control such a vast territory without instant communication? They gave local officials a lot of independence. Governors in provinces made many decisions on their own. They did not wait for approval from Rome. They could not. By the time a message arrived asking for permission, the situation might have changed completely. This created problems. A governor might make a decision the emperor disagreed with, but by the time the emperor found out, it was too late to change. The empire worked because local leaders were trusted to act in Rome's interests. But sometimes they did not. Sometimes they rebelled. Sometimes they made mistakes that cost lives. The military faced similar challenges. A general on the frontier could not ask the emperor for advice during a battle. Messages took too long. So generals had to be skilled, independent, and trustworthy. The Roman military succeeded partly because it trained officers to think for themselves. But this also meant the emperor had less control. A popular general far from Rome could become a threat. Several civil wars started this way. Historians have documented this pattern. Julius Caesar, stationed in Gaul, made decisions without consulting the Senate. By the time Rome learned about his actions, they were already done. This independence helped him win battles, but it also made him powerful enough to challenge the Republic. The slow communication that enabled military success also enabled political rebellion. Archaeologists have found evidence of this in military camps. They discovered writing tablets from Vindolanda, a fort in northern Britain. These tablets show soldiers writing home, asking for supplies, reporting on conditions. But these messages took weeks or months to arrive. By the time a soldier's family learned he was safe, he might have already moved to a different camp, or been killed in battle. Commerce was also limited by slow communication. A merchant in Alexandria might hear that grain prices are high in Rome. But by the time they load a ship and sail there, prices might have changed. There was no way to check current prices, no way to coordinate with other merchants. Trade happened, but it was slow and risky. Archaeologists have found evidence of this in shipwrecks. The Mediterranean is full of ancient Roman merchant ships that sank. These ships carried goods from one port to another, hoping prices would still be good when they arrived. Sometimes they were right, sometimes they were wrong. The uncertainty made trade a gamble. Historians have studied Roman trade routes. They found that merchants often worked in networks. A merchant in Rome would have partners in other cities. They would send letters ahead, trying to coordinate. But letters could be lost, ships could be delayed. By the time a merchant arrived, the situation might have changed completely. The best they could do was hope for the best and prepare for the worst. Financial information was especially slow. Banks existed, but they could not communicate across distances quickly. A person depositing money in Rome could not withdraw it in Gaul easily. There were no credit cards, no electronic transfers. Money had to be physically moved, which was dangerous and expensive. Archaeologists have found evidence of Roman banking. They discovered banking records on wax tablets. These tablets show loans, deposits, and transfers. But all of this happened locally. A bank in Rome could not check with a bank in Gaul. They had to trust letters, which could be forged or lost. Historians have studied how Romans handled money across distances. They found that people often carried coins with them when traveling. This was risky. Bandits could steal it. Ships could sink. But there was no other way. Some wealthy Romans used letters of credit, but these required trust and took time to verify. The system worked, but it was slow and vulnerable. Education was local. A teacher in one city had no way to share knowledge with teachers in other cities. Each school developed its own methods. There was no standardized curriculum, no way to share best practices. If a teacher discovered a better way to teach, that knowledge might never spread beyond their own students. Archaeologists have found evidence of Roman schools. They discovered school exercises on wax tablets. Students practiced writing, learned grammar, studied literature. But each teacher taught differently. A student in Rome learned one way. A student in Gaul learned another way. There was no way to compare methods or share innovations. Historians have studied Roman education. They found that wealthy families hired private tutors. These tutors traveled with families, teaching children as they moved. But most people could not afford this. Most children never went to school. They learned from their parents, or they did not learn at all. Education was a luxury, not a right. Scientific knowledge spread slowly too. A doctor in Rome might discover a new treatment, but how would doctors in other provinces learn about it? They might never hear. Medical knowledge was passed from teacher to student, generation to generation. But if the chain broke, knowledge was lost. Archaeologists have found medical texts from ancient Rome. Galen, a famous Roman doctor, wrote extensively about medicine, but his writings were expensive. Most doctors never saw them. They learned from their teachers, who learned from their teachers. Each generation might add something new, or they might forget something important. Historians have studied how medical knowledge spread. They found that doctors sometimes traveled to learn new techniques, but travel was expensive and dangerous. Most doctors stayed in their own cities, using only the knowledge they already had. A breakthrough in Rome might never reach a doctor in Gaul. A life-saving treatment might be lost simply because no one could share it. Religious information had similar limits. New ideas about gods, rituals and beliefs spread through travelers and missionaries. But this was slow. Different regions developed different practices. The empire was religiously diverse, partly because information could not spread fast enough to create uniformity. All of this might sound like a problem. And in some ways it was. But in other ways, slow communication had benefits. It forced people to be independent. It prevented rapid spread of panic or misinformation. It allowed local cultures to develop and thrive. It meant that bad decisions in one place did not immediately affect the whole empire. Historians have noted this paradox. The same slow communication that limited the empire also protected it. A rebellion in one province could not instantly spread to others. A panic in one city could not immediately affect the whole empire. The delays that frustrated coordination also prevented cascading failures. But what if that changed? What if information could travel instantly? What if a message from Rome to Britannia took 3 seconds instead of 24 days? How would smartphones transform this slow, local, oral world into a fast, global, digital one? The changes would be profound. Some would be good, some would be bad. All would be fascinating. Smartphones arrive in Rome. Millions of them appear across the empire. How would they actually work in a world without modern infrastructure? This is where engineering meets history. We need to solve real problems with creative solutions. The most basic need is keeping phones charged. Rome has no electrical grid. But it does have something else. The Mediterranean gets about 500 hours of sunshine per year. That is a lot. Modern solar panels can convert about 20% of sunlight into electricity. A small solar panel about the size of a book could charge a phone in a few hours of direct sunlight. Cloudy days create problems. Winter brings shorter days. People who work indoors need backup solutions. Engineers would need multiple power sources. One solution: hand crank generators. These are simple devices. You turn a handle, and gears spin a small generator. It is like a bicycle dynamo, but handheld. A few minutes of cranking could provide enough power for a short call or a few messages. It is not ideal, but it works. Roman engineers who were masters of mechanical devices would probably improve these cranks. They might build larger versions powered by water wheels. Roman watermills already existed. They ground grain and powered other machines. Why not use them to charge phones? A watermill could power a charging station. People could bring their phones to the mill, plug them in, and wait while they charge. It would be like a modern charging kiosk, but powered by flowing water. Wind power offers another option. Romans knew about windmills, though they used them less than watermills. Archaeologists have found evidence of wind-powered devices in some regions. But wind could spin generators too. A small windmill on a roof could charge multiple phones. Or a larger windmill in a town square could power a public charging station. The Mediterranean has consistent winds. Sailors used these winds for thousands of years. The same winds that powered ships could power generators. Coastal cities would have an advantage. They could use both wind and water power. Inland cities might rely more on water wheels and hand cranks. Historians have noted that Romans were practical. They used whatever resources were available. In windy areas they might build more windmills. In areas with flowing water they might build more water wheels. The empire would adapt, using local resources to power the new technology. Battery technology is trickier. Modern lithium-ion batteries are complex. They require rare materials like lithium and cobalt. These would be impossible to manufacture in ancient Rome. So the phones that arrive would need to come with enough batteries to last years. Or they would need simpler battery technology. One possibility: lead-acid batteries. These are much simpler. They were invented in the 1800s, but the basic principles could work in ancient Rome. Lead and sulfuric acid are the main ingredients. Romans had access to both. The batteries would be larger and heavier than modern ones, but they would work. They could store power from solar panels or hand cranks for use at night. Archaeologists have found evidence of Roman lead production. They discovered lead mines and smelting operations. Romans used lead for pipes, weights, and other purposes. They had the knowledge to work with lead. Sulfuric acid is trickier, but Romans knew about acids. They used vinegar and other acids in various processes. With time, they might learn to produce sulfuric acid. Historians have studied Roman chemistry. They found that Romans understood many chemical processes. They made glass, pottery, and metal alloys. They understood acids and bases. They might not understand electricity, but they could learn to build and maintain batteries. The technology would be new, but the materials and skills already existed. The bigger challenge is networks. How do phones communicate without cell towers or satellites? This is where mesh networking becomes crucial. A mesh network works like this. Your phone wants to send a message to someone far away. Instead of connecting directly, which is impossible, your phone connects to a nearby phone. That phone connects to another phone, and so on. The message hops from phone to phone until it reaches its destination. But there is a problem. What if there are gaps? What if no phones exist between you and your destination? The message would get stuck. To solve this, Rome would need relay stations. Roman infrastructure helps. The empire already had a network of road stations, called mutations and mansions. Mutations were small stations every 10 miles or so, where travelers could change horses. Mansions were larger rest stops, maybe every 20 miles with food and lodging. These stations were perfectly positioned for relay phones. Archaeologists have excavated many of these stations. They found stables, storage rooms, and sometimes small buildings. The stations were strategically placed along major roads. They formed a network that covered the entire empire. This network already existed, it just needed phones added to it. Historians have mapped the Roman road system. They found that major roads had stations every 10 to 15 miles. This spacing was perfect for relay phones. A message could hop from station to station, following the same routes that couriers used. The infrastructure was already there. The technology just needed to use it. Imagine this. Every major road station gets a dedicated relay phone. This phone stays plugged into a solar panel or water wheel generator. It never moves. It just sits there, receiving and forwarding messages. When your phone wants to send a message, it connects to the nearest relay station. The relay station forwards it to the next station along the road. Message by message, hop by hop, your communication travels across the empire. Roads are not the only paths. Sea routes matter too. Roman ships traveled regularly across the Mediterranean. Archaeologists have found evidence of extensive maritime trade. Ships carried goods, people, and information. Ships could carry relay phones too. A ship sailing from Rome to Alexandria could act as a moving relay station. Messages could hop from land station to ship to land station. This would create a network covering both land and sea routes. Historians have studied Roman shipping. They found that ships traveled regular routes. Some ships sailed daily between major ports. These ships could carry relay phones, creating moving network nodes. A message from Rome might travel by land to a port, then by ship to another port, then by land again. The network would follow the same paths that trade already used. Archaeologists have found shipwrecks with cargo still intact. These wrecks reveal the scale of Roman maritime trade. Ships carried grain, wine, olive oil, and other goods across the Mediterranean. The same ships could carry relay phones. The maritime network would complement the land network, creating a comprehensive communication system. The network would not be as fast as modern cell networks. Messages might take minutes or even hours to travel long distances, depending on how many hops were needed. But compared to weeks by courier, this would be revolutionary. Engineers have studied mesh networks in modern contexts. They found that messages can travel hundreds of miles in minutes, even with multiple hops. Each phone acts as a relay, forwarding messages to the next phone. The more phones in the network, the faster messages travel. In a dense area like a city, messages might travel almost instantly. In remote areas, they might take longer, but still much faster than couriers. The network would be self-organizing. Phones would automatically find the best path for each message. If one route was blocked, messages would find another route. The network would adapt, using whatever phones were available. This resilience would be crucial in a world without centralized infrastructure. What about areas with no roads? Remote regions, mountains, deserts. These would be harder. Maybe the empire would need to build new relay stations. Or maybe messages would travel more slowly through these areas, using whatever phones existed there. The network would be strongest along major routes, weaker in remote areas. This mirrors how Roman control was strongest in cities and along roads, weaker in the countryside. Data storage presents challenges. Modern phones store huge amounts of information. But in ancient Rome, there would be no cloud storage. No internet to download apps or updates. Each phone would need to be self-contained. Maybe phones arrive preloaded with useful information. Maps of the empire. Translation dictionaries between Latin, Greek, and major local languages. Medical guides with treatments for common diseases. Engineering manuals with instructions for building roads, aqueducts, and buildings. Agricultural guides with planting and harvesting schedules. Legal texts with Roman laws and court decisions. This would be like having a library in your pocket. For the first time, a farmer in Gaul could access the same medical knowledge as a doctor in Rome. A merchant in Alexandria could check the same legal codes as a lawyer in the capital. Knowledge would become portable and accessible. Archaeologists have found evidence of what knowledge Romans valued. They discovered medical texts, engineering manuals, and agricultural guides. These texts were expensive and rare. Most people never saw them. But if phones came preloaded with this information, it would be available to everyone. A farmer could look up how to treat a sick animal. A builder could check how to construct an arch. Knowledge would spread from elites to everyone. Historians have studied how knowledge was preserved in ancient Rome. They found that most knowledge was oral. Written texts were rare and expensive. But phones could change this. Suddenly, written knowledge would be accessible to anyone with a phone. The literacy revolution would be matched by an information revolution. Peer-to-peer sharing changes everything. Phones could share information directly with each other, without needing a network. If you have a useful app or document, you could beam it to someone nearby. This is called Bluetooth or near-field communication in our world. In ancient Rome, it would work the same way. Imagine a teacher in Rome creates a new educational app. They share it with their students. Those students share it with friends. Friends share it with their families. Slowly the app spreads across the empire, phone to phone, person to person. No central server needed. No internet required. Just phones talking to each other. This would create a new kind of information network, not top-down, like the imperial postal system, but bottom-up, spreading organically through social connections. Knowledge would flow through the empire in ways the government could not control. Engineers have studied peer-to-peer networks. They found that information can spread quickly through social connections. A useful app might reach thousands of people in weeks, even without a central server. Each person who receives it can share it with others. The network grows organically, following social patterns. Historians have noted that Roman society was highly social. People gathered in forums, marketplaces and baths. They travel for festivals and games. These social connections would help spread phone apps. A merchant traveling from city to city might share apps with people he meets. A soldier returning home might bring new apps to his village. The network would follow the same paths that people already traveled. Language would be crucial. The Roman Empire was multilingual. Latin was official, but Greek was common in the East. Local languages existed everywhere: Celtic in Gaul, Punic in North Africa, Aramaic in Syria, and many others. Phones would need to handle all of these. Maybe phones come with translation software. You speak in your language, the phone translates to another language, and the recipient hears it in their language. This would be like having a universal translator. For the first time, people who did not share a common language could communicate directly. Archaeologists have found evidence of the Roman Empire's linguistic diversity. Inscriptions show Latin, Greek, Celtic, Punic, Aramaic, and many other languages. The empire was multilingual, but communication between language groups was difficult. Most people learned only their local language and maybe Latin or Greek. Translation was slow and expensive. Historians have studied how Romans handled language barriers. They found that educated Romans often learned multiple languages. But most people did not. A Gaul and a Greek might both speak some Latin, but not enough for complex conversations. With translation software, they could communicate directly, in their own languages. This would break down barriers that had existed for centuries. Or maybe phones teach people to read and write. If a phone has a text-based interface, users would need basic literacy. This could drive a literacy revolution. People would learn to read not because schools required it, but because phones made it useful. Suddenly, reading becomes a practical skill, not just an elite luxury. Archaeologists have found evidence of literacy rates in ancient Rome. They discovered writing exercises, graffiti, and inscriptions. These suggest that maybe 20 to 30% of the population could read. But this varied by region and social class. In cities, literacy was higher. In rural areas, it was lower. Among elites, most could read. Among commoners, few could. Historians have studied how literacy spread in other societies. They found that when reading becomes useful, people learn to read. In ancient Rome, reading was useful mainly for elites. But if phones made reading useful for everyone, literacy rates would rise. A farmer who could read market prices would have an advantage. A merchant who could read messages would be more successful. The incentive to learn would be strong. This literacy revolution would have cascading effects. More literate people means more people who can read laws, contracts, and official documents. More people who can write means more people who can record information. The empire would become more literate, more documented, more connected. Durability is another challenge. Ancient Rome was rough on technology. Dust, rain, heat, cold, drops, impacts. Phones would need to be tough. Maybe they come in protective cases. Maybe they are built stronger than modern phones, with thicker screens and reinforced frames. Repair would be difficult. If a phone breaks, there are no repair shops. No replacement parts. Users would need to be careful. Or maybe Roman engineers would learn to fix them. They were skilled with mechanical devices. Given time, they might figure out how to repair electronic ones too. Security is a major concern. In our world, we worry about hackers. In ancient Rome, the concern would be spies and enemies. What if a barbarian tribe captures phones? What if rebels use them to coordinate attacks? The empire would need encryption. Encryption means scrambling messages, so only the intended recipient can read them. Modern phones use complex mathematical codes. But simpler encryption existed in ancient times. The Caesar cipher, named after Julius Caesar, shifted letters by a certain number. A becomes D, B becomes E, and so on. With a shared key, sender and receiver could encode and decode messages. Historians have found evidence that Romans used encryption. They discovered encoded messages in military contexts. Generals used codes to protect sensitive information. But these codes were simple. They could be broken with enough effort. Phones could use more complex codes, making messages much harder to intercept. Archaeologists have studied Roman military communication. They found that messages were sometimes encoded, but the methods were basic. With phones, encryption could be much more sophisticated. Messages could be scrambled using mathematical algorithms that would be nearly impossible to break without the key. This would protect military secrets, but it would also protect private communications. Phones could use similar methods. Or they could use more complex codes that would be harder to break. The key point is that encryption would be essential. Without it, the network would be vulnerable. But encryption creates a problem for the government. If messages are encrypted, officials cannot read them. This limits surveillance. The emperor might want to monitor communications to prevent rebellion. But if phones encrypt everything, monitoring becomes impossible. This creates tension between privacy and control. Another security issue: identity verification. How do you know a message really came from who it claims to be from? In our world, we use digital signatures and certificates. In ancient Rome, simpler methods might work. Maybe phones have unique identifiers. Maybe users need to verify their identity when sending important messages. This would be like signing a letter, but digital. Not everyone would adopt phones immediately. Some people would be suspicious. Some would not understand how to use them. Some would prefer traditional methods. Adoption would be gradual. But once people saw the benefits, adoption would accelerate. A merchant who can check prices instantly has an advantage over one who cannot. A general who can coordinate with distant legions wins more battles. A family that can stay in touch across provinces feels more connected. These advantages would drive adoption. Within a few years, phones might become essential. Not having one would put you at a disadvantage. The technology would spread from cities to countryside, from elites to commoners, from early adopters to everyone else. This creates infrastructure demands. More relay stations, more charging stations, more repair capabilities. The empire would need to invest in this infrastructure, but the benefits would justify the costs. Faster communication means better control, better commerce, better everything. Phones would work in ancient Rome, but with adaptations. Solar and hand crank power would keep them charged. Mesh networks using road stations as relays would enable communication. Preloaded information and peer-to-peer sharing would spread knowledge. Translation software would bridge language barriers. Durability and security would be crucial. And gradual adoption would eventually make phones essential. Imagine you are a Roman general. You are leading 3 legions, about 15,000 soldiers, in a campaign against barbarian tribes. Your forces are spread across a front that stretches for 50 miles. In the old world, coordinating this would be nearly impossible. Messages between units took hours or days. By the time you learned about a problem, it might be too late to respond. You have smartphones. Every centurion, every unit commander has one. You can send orders instantly. You can receive updates in real time. You can coordinate movements with precision never before possible. Tactical coordination changes completely. In a battle, timing is everything. If one unit attacks too early or too late, the whole plan fails. With phones, units can coordinate perfectly. Attack on my signal, you message. All units see the message simultaneously. They attack together. No confusion, no delays. Historians have studied Roman military tactics. They found that coordination was crucial but difficult. Generals used flags, horns, and messengers to coordinate units. But these methods were slow and unreliable. A flag might not be visible in fog. A horn might not be heard over battle noise. A messenger might be killed before delivering the message. Archaeologists have found evidence of Roman military communication. They discovered signal towers, where soldiers could light fires to send messages. But these were limited. They could only send simple signals, and only if the weather was clear. With phones, generals could send detailed orders instantly, regardless of weather or distance. The tactical advantage would be enormous. Reconnaissance becomes faster too. Scouts can send back reports instantly. Enemy forces spotted, 2 miles north, about 500 strong. You receive this in seconds. You can adjust your plans immediately. In the old world, a scout might take hours to return with news. By then, the situation might have changed completely. Historians have documented how Roman scouts worked. They rode ahead of the main army, looking for enemies, checking terrain, finding water sources. When they found something important, they rode back to report. This could take hours or even days. By the time the general learned about an enemy force, it might have moved. The information was always slightly out of date. Archaeologists have found evidence of Roman scouting. They discovered small camps where scouts might have stayed. They found horse remains that suggest fast riding. But no matter how fast the scout rode, there was always a delay. With phones, scouts could send updates continuously. The general would know the enemy's position in real time. The tactical advantage would be game-changing. Supply chains improve dramatically. The quartermaster can check inventory in real time. "We need more grain at the northern camp," the message goes out. Supply wagons are redirected instantly. No more running out of food because messages arrived too late. Historians have studied Roman military logistics. They found that supply was a constant challenge. Armies needed food, water, weapons, and equipment. But coordinating supply was difficult. A quartermaster might not know how much grain was left at a distant camp. By the time they learned supplies were low, it might be too late to send more. Archaeologists have found evidence of Roman supply depots. They discovered storage buildings, grain silos, and supply routes. But these systems relied on messengers and estimates. With phones, quartermasters could track inventory in real time. They could coordinate supply across multiple camps. They could redirect wagons before shortages occurred. The logistical advantage would be enormous. Instant communication creates new possibilities. You can coordinate multiple armies across vast distances. While you fight in the north, another general fights in the east. You can share intelligence. We learned the enemy uses this tactic. That knowledge spreads instantly to all commanders. The whole empire's military becomes a coordinated network. This is powerful. But it also creates vulnerabilities. What if enemies capture phones? What if they intercept messages? What if they use the network against you? Security becomes crucial. Messages must be encrypted. Only authorized personnel should have phones. Lost phones must be deactivated immediately. The military would develop strict protocols. Phones would be treated like weapons, valuable tools that must be protected. But even with security, the network creates risks. If the network goes down, coordination fails. If too many phones break, communication degrades. The military would become dependent on technology. This is both a strength and a weakness. The emperor and imperial administration face new realities. In the Old World, the emperor in Rome had limited control over distant provinces. Governors made many decisions independently. By the time the emperor learned about a problem, it might be too late to intervene. Historians have documented this pattern. They found that emperors often learned about events weeks or months after they happened. A governor might raise taxes, start a war, or make a major decision. By the time the emperor found out, it was already done. The emperor could approve or disapprove, but could not prevent. Archaeologists have found evidence of imperial communication. They discovered letters between emperors and governors. These letters show the delays and uncertainties. An emperor might ask a governor about a situation, but by the time the governor replied, the situation had changed. The emperor was always slightly out of touch with distant provinces. With phones, this changes completely. The emperor can ask questions and get answers in minutes. They can give orders and see them executed in real time. They can monitor governors, check on situations, and intervene immediately. The level of control would be unprecedented. With phones, this changes. The emperor can communicate with any governor instantly. What is the situation in Gaul? A message arrives in seconds. Send me a report on grain supplies in Egypt. Done. The emperor gains unprecedented control. This sounds good for the emperor, but it creates problems too. If the emperor micromanages everything, governors lose independence. They become less capable. They wait for instructions instead of acting. The system becomes rigid. Innovation slows. Historians have studied how empires manage distant territories. they found that successful empires balance control and independence. Too much control creates rigidity. Too much independence creates chaos. The Roman Empire worked because it found this balance. But with phones, the balance would shift toward more control. This might make the empire more stable, but also more fragile. If the emperor made a bad decision, it would affect the whole empire instantly. Archaeologists have found evidence of local decision-making. They discovered that governors often made important choices without consulting Rome. This independence allowed the empire to adapt to local conditions. But with phones, governors might wait for instructions instead of acting. The system would become more centralized, but also more dependent on the emperor's judgment. Information overload becomes a problem. In the old world, only urgent messages reached the emperor. Everything else was handled locally. With phones, the emperor might receive hundreds of messages per day. How do you prioritize? How do you respond to everything? The emperor would need a staff, a bureaucracy, to filter and process information. Historians have studied how leaders handle information. They found that too much information can be as bad as too little. An emperor who receives hundreds of messages daily might miss the important ones. They might respond to trivial matters while ignoring crises. The system would need filters, priorities, and assistance. Archaeologists have found evidence of Roman bureaucracy. They discovered that emperors had staffs of secretaries, advisors, and administrators. But these staffs were small. They could handle the limited information that arrived by courier. With phones, the information flow would increase dramatically. The bureaucracy would need to grow, or important messages would be lost in the flood. This creates a paradox. More communication means more information. More information means more need for filtering. More filtering means more bureaucracy. The system becomes more complex even as it becomes more efficient. The emperor gains control, but also gains responsibility for managing that control. Transparency changes everything. In the old world, information was controlled. The emperor decided what people knew. With phones, information spreads quickly. A governor cannot hide a rebellion. A general cannot cover up a defeat. News travels fast, and everyone can share it. Historians have documented how information control worked in ancient Rome. They found that emperors often suppressed bad news. A military defeat might be reported as a victory. A famine might be hidden until it was too late. This control helped maintain stability, but it also prevented early responses to problems. Archaeologists have found evidence of information suppression. They discovered that some inscriptions were defaced or removed. Official records sometimes omitted embarrassing events. The system was designed to control what people knew. But with phones, this control would be much harder. Information would spread too fast to suppress. This creates pressure for accountability. If people know about problems instantly, they expect solutions instantly. The emperor cannot ignore crises. Governors cannot hide failures. The whole system becomes more responsive but also more demanding. Every problem becomes public immediately. Every failure becomes visible. The pressure to perform would be constant. Law and justice transform. In the old world, legal cases were local. A judge in Gaul made decisions based on local knowledge and Roman law as they understood it. There was no way to check how similar cases were decided in other provinces. No way to ensure consistency. Archaeologists have found evidence of Roman legal practice. They discovered court records, legal texts, and judicial decisions. These show that judges often made decisions based on local customs and their own understanding of Roman law. There was no central database of precedents. Each judge worked independently. Historians have studied how Roman law evolved. They found that legal principles developed slowly, through practice and tradition. A decision in one province might influence decisions in other provinces, but only if judges heard about it. With phones, judges could consult with each other instantly. They could check precedents, share interpretations, and ensure consistency. The legal system would become more uniform, but also more rigid. With phones, this changes. Judges can consult with each other. How did you rule in a similar case? Legal databases can be shared. Precedents can be established and spread. The legal system becomes more uniform across the empire. Historians have noted that Roman law was both universal and local. The same basic principles applied everywhere, but local customs influenced how they were applied. A case in Gaul might be decided differently than a similar case in Syria, based on local traditions. This flexibility helped the law adapt to different cultures. But with phones, this flexibility might decrease. Judges would consult with each other more, they would follow precedents more closely. The law would become more uniform but also less adaptable. A case that should be decided based on local customs might be forced into a standard framework. The law becomes more rigid, even as it becomes more consistent. This creates a tension. Uniformity makes the law fairer and more predictable. But rigidity makes it less responsive to local needs. The empire would need to balance these competing demands. Some cases might require local flexibility. Others might require universal standards. The system would need to decide which is which. Taxation and administration improve too. Tax collectors can report collections in real time. We collected 10,000 denarii this month. The central government knows immediately. No more waiting months for reports. No more lost records. Financial administration becomes transparent and efficient. Archaeologists have found evidence of Roman tax collection. They discovered tax records, receipts, and administrative documents. These show that tax collection was complex and often slow. Collectors had to travel, assess property, collect payments, and report back to Rome. This process took months or even years. Historians have studied Roman financial administration. They found that the system relied on local officials who reported to central authorities. But these reports were slow and sometimes lost. A tax collector might report collections, but the report might not reach Rome for months. By then, the situation might have changed. The system worked, but it was inefficient. With phones, this changes completely. Tax collectors can report instantly. The central government knows immediately how much was collected, where it came from, and who paid. Financial administration becomes transparent and efficient. But this also means the government can monitor everything. If every transaction is recorded and reported, privacy disappears. The state gains unprecedented visibility into economic activity. This is powerful for control, but concerning for freedom. Rebellions and civil wars take new forms. In the Old World, a general far from Rome could rebel. By the time the emperor learned about it, the rebellion might be well established. With phones, the emperor would know instantly. General Marcus has declared himself emperor in Gaul. The message arrives in seconds. The emperor can respond immediately, sending loyal forces to suppress the rebellion before it spreads. Historians have documented many Roman civil wars. They found that most started when a general far from Rome declared himself emperor. By the time the emperor in Rome learned about it, the rebel general had already gathered support, raised armies, and started marching. The rebellion was well established before the emperor could respond. Archaeologists have found evidence of these conflicts. They discovered battle sites, military camps, and fortifications. These show that civil wars were common and destructive. The empire spent much of its energy fighting internal conflicts. With phones, the emperor could respond faster, potentially preventing rebellions from gaining momentum. But this speed works both ways. Rebels could also use phones to coordinate. They could spread their message instantly. They could organize supporters across vast distances. A rebellion might be smaller, but it could be better coordinated. The network helps both sides, making conflicts faster and more intense. Rebels can also use phones. They can coordinate with each other. They can spread propaganda. They can organize across vast distances. A rebellion might be smaller, but it could be better coordinated. The network helps both sides. False information becomes a major problem. In the old world, rumors spread slowly. There was time to verify facts. With phones, false information spreads instantly. The emperor is dead. A false message could trigger panic, rebellion, or chaos before anyone could verify the truth. Historians have documented how rumors affected ancient Rome. They found that false information sometimes caused panic, but it spread slowly enough that authorities could respond. A false rumor about an invasion might take days to spread. By then, officials could investigate and correct it. Archaeologists have found evidence of information control. They discovered that authorities sometimes posted official corrections to rumors. But these corrections were slow. By the time they were posted, the damage might already be done. With phones, false information would spread instantly. Corrections would need to be just as fast, or they would be too late. The government would need to combat misinformation, but how? You cannot stop people from sharing messages. You can try to spread correct information, but false information might spread faster. This is a problem we face in our world too. Ancient Rome would face it as well. The same technology that enables truth to spread also enables lies to spread. The challenge would be constant. Diplomacy accelerates. In the old world, diplomatic messages took weeks or months. Negotiations were slow. With phones, diplomats can communicate instantly. Treaties can be negotiated faster. Alliances can be formed quickly. But this speed might also lead to hasty decisions. Sometimes, slow communication forces careful thought. Fast communication might encourage rash actions. Historians have studied Roman diplomacy. They found that negotiations with foreign powers were slow and deliberate. Messages traveled back and forth for months. Each side had time to consider proposals, consult advisors, and think carefully. This slowness prevented hasty decisions that might lead to war. Archaeologists have found evidence of diplomatic exchanges. They discovered letters between Roman emperors and foreign rulers. These letters show the careful, formal language of diplomacy. Each message was crafted carefully, knowing it would take weeks to arrive and weeks more to receive a reply. With phones, this changes. Diplomats could negotiate in real time. Proposals and counter-proposals could fly back and forth in minutes. Treaties could be drafted and signed in days instead of months. But this speed might also lead to mistakes. A hasty decision made in anger might be regretted later. The careful deliberation that slow communication forced would be lost. The common people gain new connections. In the old world, most people had little direct contact with imperial administration. They dealt with local officials. The emperor was distant, almost mythical. Archaeologists have found evidence of how ordinary Romans viewed the emperor. They discovered inscriptions, graffiti, and private letters. These show that most people never saw the emperor. They knew about him through coins, statues, and official announcements. But they had no way to communicate with him directly. Historians have studied the relationship between emperors and common people. They found that emperors sometimes tried to connect with the people through public appearances, games, and distributions of food. But these were rare events. Most people lived their entire lives without any direct contact with imperial power. With phones, this changes. People could message the emperor, or at least message officials who could pass messages to the emperor. Petitions could be submitted instantly. Complaints could be filed immediately. The government would become more accessible, but also more overwhelmed. The emperor who once seemed distant would suddenly be reachable, at least in theory. With phones, this changes. People could message the emperor directly. Well, not directly, but through official channels. Petitions could be submitted instantly. Complaints could be filed immediately. The government would become more accessible, but also more overwhelmed. Historians have documented how Romans submitted petitions. They found that people sometimes traveled to Rome to present petitions to the emperor. This was expensive and time-consuming. Most people never did it. They accepted their situation because they had no way to change it. Archaeologists have found evidence of petitions. They discovered written requests for help, justice, or favors. But these were rare. Most people never submitted petitions because the process was too difficult. With phones, submitting a petition would be easy. Everyone could do it. The government would be flooded with requests, complaints, and demands. People could also organize more easily. If farmers in one province are unhappy with taxes, they can coordinate with farmers in other provinces. Protests could be organized across the empire. The government would face new challenges from organized citizen action. The same technology that enables government control also enables citizen resistance. The balance of power would shift, but the government could also use phones for propaganda. Official messages could be sent to everyone. The emperor has won a great victory. News could be shaped and controlled. The network becomes a tool for both communication and manipulation. Historians have studied how Roman emperors used propaganda. They found that emperors controlled information to shape public opinion. They commissioned statues, coins, and inscriptions that showed them as powerful, just, and successful. But this propaganda was slow. It took months to spread across the empire. Archaeologists have found evidence of imperial propaganda. They discovered coins with emperor portraits, statues in public squares, and inscriptions praising imperial achievements. But these were permanent and slow to change. With phones, propaganda could be instant and constantly updated. The emperor could send messages to everyone, shaping news in real time. This creates a new form of control. The government could not stop people from sharing information, but it could flood the network with official messages. It could respond instantly to rumors, shape narratives, and control the conversation. The network becomes a tool for both communication and manipulation. The same technology that enables free speech also enables propaganda. Phones would revolutionize military strategy and governance. They would enable precise coordination, faster responses, and better control. But they would also create vulnerabilities, information overload, and new forms of conflict. The balance of power would shift. The emperor would gain control, but also face new pressures. The system would become more efficient, but also more complex. Would these changes make Rome stronger or weaker? Would better communication lead to better governance, or just faster mistakes? Would instant coordination create a more stable empire, or a more fragile one? These are questions without easy answers. But they are questions worth exploring, because they help us understand how technology shapes power, and how power shapes society. Smartphones would change everyday life. not just for generals and emperors, but for regular people, merchants, farmers, teachers, families. Their world would transform. Commerce changes first. In the Old World, a merchant in Alexandria had no way to know grain prices in Rome. They might hear rumors, but rumors were unreliable. By the time they loaded a ship and sailed to Rome, prices might have changed completely. Trading was a gamble. Archaeologists have found evidence of Roman trade. They discovered shipwrecks full of goods, warehouses in port cities, and trade records. These show that merchants took huge risks. They loaded ships with goods, hoping prices would still be good when they arrived. Sometimes they were right. Sometimes they lost everything. Historians have studied how Roman merchants worked. They found that merchants often relied on networks of partners in different cities. They would send letters ahead, trying to coordinate. But letters could be lost or delayed. By the time a merchant arrived, the situation might have changed. The uncertainty made trade risky and expensive. With phones, this changes completely. Merchants can check prices in real time. They can coordinate with partners instantly. They can make informed decisions before loading ships. Trading becomes less risky and more efficient. But this also means prices become more uniform. If everyone knows the price in Rome, local prices adjust. The advantage of information asymmetry disappears. With phones, this changes. Merchants can check prices in real time. What is grain selling for in Rome today? A message arrives instantly. They can make informed decisions. They can coordinate with other merchants. I have grain in Alexandria. You have buyers in Rome. Let's make a deal. Commerce becomes faster and more efficient. Historians have noted that information asymmetry was a major source of profit in ancient trade. A merchant who knew prices in different cities could buy low and sell high, but this required knowledge that was hard to get. With phones, everyone would have access to price information. The playing field would level. Archaeologists have found evidence of price variations. They discovered that the same goods sold for different prices in different cities. A merchant who knew these differences could profit. But with phones, price information would spread instantly. Local prices would adjust to match distant prices. Some merchants might lose profits, but consumers might benefit from fairer prices. This creates a more efficient market. Goods would flow to where they are needed most. Prices would reflect true supply and demand. But it also creates new challenges. Local merchants who relied on information advantages would struggle. The market would become more competitive, but also more volatile. Financial transactions improved too. In the Old World, if you deposited money in a bank in Rome, you could not easily withdraw it in Gaul. Money had to be physically moved, which was dangerous and expensive. With phones, banks could coordinate. This person has an account in Rome. Allow them to withdraw in Gaul. Digital money transfers become possible, even without modern banking systems. Archaeologists have found evidence of Roman banking. They discovered banking records, loan documents, and financial contracts. These show that banking existed, but it was local. A bank in Rome could not easily coordinate with a bank in Gaul. People had to carry money or use letters of credit, which were slow and risky. Historians have studied how Romans handled money across distances. They found that people often carried coins when traveling. This was dangerous. Bandits could steal it. Ships could sink. But there was no other way. Some wealthy Romans used letters of credit, but these required trust and took time to verify. The system worked, but it was slow and vulnerable. With phones, banks could coordinate instantly. A person could deposit money in Rome and withdraw it in Gaul. The banks would verify the transaction through the phone network. Digital money transfers become possible, even without modern banking systems. But this requires trust. How do you verify someone's identity? How do you prevent fraud? The system would need secure verification methods. But this requires trust. How do you verify someone's identity? How do you prevent fraud? Banks would need secure systems. Maybe phones have digital signatures. Maybe there are verification codes. The technology would need to solve these problems, or digital money would not work. Historians have studied how Romans verified identity. They found that people used seals, signatures, and witnesses. But these methods were slow and could be forged. With phones, verification would need to be instant and secure. Digital signatures could work, but they would require infrastructure that did not exist. Archaeologists have found evidence of Roman identity verification. They discovered seals, signatures on documents, and witness lists. These show that Romans understood the need to verify identity, but their methods were basic. With phones, the system would need more sophisticated methods. Phones might have unique identifiers. Users might need passwords or codes. The technology would need to solve these problems, or digital money would not work. This creates a challenge. Digital money would be convenient, but it would also require new security measures. The empire would need to develop systems for identity verification, fraud prevention, and dispute resolution. These systems would be complex, but they would enable a financial revolution. Education transforms. In the old world, education was local. A teacher in one city had no way to share knowledge with teachers elsewhere. Each school developed independently. There was no standardized curriculum, no way to share best practices. Archaeologists have found evidence of Roman schools. They discovered school buildings, writing exercises, and educational materials. These show that education existed, but it was fragmented. Each teacher taught differently. There was no way to compare methods or share innovations. Historians have studied how Roman education worked. They found that wealthy families hired private tutors. These tutors traveled with families, teaching children as they moved. But most people could not afford this. Most children never went to school. They learned from their parents, or they did not learn at all. Education was a luxury, not a right. With phones, this changes. Teachers can share lesson plans instantly. They can compare methods, discuss challenges, and learn from each other. Educational apps could be created and shared. A student in Gaul could access the same learning materials as a student in Rome. Education becomes more uniform and accessible. But this also means less local variation. Each school might teach the same way, losing the diversity that came from independence. With phones, this changes. Teachers can share lesson plans instantly. This teaching method works well. That knowledge spreads. Educational apps could be created and shared. A student in Gaul could access the same learning materials as a student in Rome. Education becomes more uniform and accessible. Historians have noted that Roman education varied by region. A student in Rome learned different things than a student in Gaul. This variation reflected local cultures and needs. But with phones, education could become more standardized. The same curriculum could be taught everywhere. This would create more uniformity, but also less local adaptation. Archaeologists have found evidence of educational diversity. They discovered different teaching methods, different texts, and different approaches. This diversity helped education adapt to local needs. But with phones, this diversity might decrease. Teachers would share methods, creating more uniformity. The system would become more efficient, but also less flexible. Literacy becomes revolutionary. In the old world, maybe 20 to 30% of people could read. Phones with text interfaces would require basic literacy. This could drive a literacy revolution. People would learn to read not because schools required it, but because phones made it useful. Archaeologists have found evidence of literacy rates. They discovered writing exercises, graffiti, and inscriptions. These suggest that literacy varied by region and social class. In cities, maybe 30% could read. In rural areas, maybe 10%. Among elites, most could read. Among commoners, few could. Historians have studied how literacy spread in other societies. They found that when reading becomes useful, people learn to read. In ancient Rome, reading was useful mainly for elites, but if phones made reading useful for everyone, literacy rates would rise. A farmer who could read market prices would have an advantage. A merchant who could read messages would be more successful. The incentive to learn would be strong. This literacy revolution would have cascading effects. More literate people means more people who can read laws, contracts, and official documents. More people who can write means more people who can record information. The empire would become more literate, more documented, more connected. But this also means more people who can read and spread information, including false information. The literacy revolution would enable both truth and lies to spread faster. Imagine a farmer who never learned to read. They get a phone. To use it, they need to read messages, so they learn. Maybe their children teach them. Maybe they use the phone's built-in learning apps. Slowly, literacy spreads. Within a generation, literacy rates might double or triple. This would be revolutionary. Historians have documented similar literacy revolutions. When printing presses spread in Europe, literacy rates rose dramatically. When newspapers became common, more people learned to read. The pattern is clear. When reading becomes useful, people learn to read. Phones would create the same incentive. Archaeologists have found evidence of how Romans learned to read. They discovered school exercises, practice tablets, and teaching materials. These show that learning to read was a long process. But with phones, the process might accelerate. People would have immediate motivation to learn. They would see the benefits every day. The learning would be practical, not abstract. This literacy revolution would transform society. More people could read laws, understand contracts, and access information. More people could write, record their thoughts, and communicate in new ways. The empire would become more literate, more documented, more connected. But this also creates new challenges. More literate people means more people who can read and spread information, including false information. The literacy revolution would enable both truth and lies to spread faster. But phones could also teach other skills: language learning apps, math tutorials, engineering guides, medical information. Knowledge that was once limited to elites becomes accessible to everyone. A farmer could learn advanced agricultural techniques. A craftsman could learn new building methods. The spread of knowledge accelerates dramatically. Archaeologists have found evidence of how knowledge was preserved. They discovered medical texts, engineering manuals, and agricultural guides. But these were expensive and rare. Most people never saw them. With phones, this knowledge would be available to everyone. A farmer could look up how to treat a sick animal. A builder could check how to construct an arch. Knowledge would spread from elites to everyone. Historians have studied how knowledge spread in ancient Rome. they found that most knowledge was oral. Written texts were rare and expensive. But phones could change this. Suddenly, written knowledge would be accessible to anyone with a phone. The literacy revolution would be matched by an information revolution. People could learn skills that were once reserved for specialists. The spread of knowledge would accelerate dramatically. This creates new possibilities. A farmer could learn advanced agricultural techniques. A craftsman could learn new building methods. A merchant could learn accounting and finance. Knowledge that was once limited to elites becomes accessible to everyone. The empire would become more skilled, more innovative, more capable. But this also means more competition. If everyone can learn the same skills, the advantage of specialized knowledge decreases. Families and relationships change. In the old world, if your family moved to a different province, you might never see them again. Letters took months. Travel was difficult. Families drifted apart. Archaeologists have found evidence of this separation. They discovered letters from soldiers to their families, merchants to their partners, and children to their parents. These letters show the pain of separation. People wrote about missing each other, about not knowing if their loved ones were safe, about the difficulty of staying connected across vast distances. Historians have studied how Romans maintained family connections. They found that families often split when members moved for work, military service, or opportunity. A son might join the army and never return. A daughter might marry and move to a different province. Families stayed connected through letters, but letters were slow and could be lost. With phones, this changes. Families can stay connected instantly. A soldier can message his family every day. A merchant can talk to his partner in real time. A child can share daily experiences with distant parents. The emotional bonds remain strong, even when physical separation is long. But this also changes family dynamics. Parents might stay involved in adult children's lives in ways that were impossible before. The balance between independence and connection would shift. With phones, this changes. You can message family members instantly. How are you? I miss you. When are you visiting? Families stay connected across vast distances. The emotional bonds remain strong, even when physical separation is long. Historians have documented how separation affected Roman families. They found that families often lost touch when members moved away. A soldier might not hear from his family for months. A merchant might not know if his children were safe. The uncertainty created anxiety and loneliness. Archaeologists have found evidence of this anxiety. They discovered letters expressing worry, asking for news, and begging for replies. These letters show how important communication was, and how difficult it was to maintain. With phones, this anxiety would decrease. Families could stay connected, reducing the emotional cost of separation. But this constant connection also changes relationships. In the old world, when children left home, they gained independence. Parents could not micromanage from far away. With phones, parents might stay involved in adult children's lives in ways that were impossible before. This could be good or bad, depending on the family. Some families would benefit from closer connection. Others might struggle with boundaries. Family dynamics shift. In the old world, when children left home, they gained independence. Parents could not micromanage from far away. With phones, parents might stay involved in adult children's lives in ways that were impossible before. This could be good or bad, depending on the family. Romantic relationships change too. In the old world, long-distance relationships were nearly impossible. With phones, couples can stay in touch. They can share daily experiences. Look at this sunset. I'm thinking of you. Relationships can survive separation. Archaeologists have found evidence of how Romans handled long-distance relationships. They discovered letters between separated couples, expressing love, longing, and commitment. But these letters were slow. A couple might exchange letters only a few times per year. The relationship survived, but it was difficult. Historians have studied how separation affected Roman marriages. They found that couples often separated when one partner moved for work or military service. Some marriages survived through letters, others did not. The difficulty of maintaining connection across distance was a major challenge. With phones, this changes. Couples can stay in touch daily. They can share experiences, express feelings, and maintain connection. Relationships can survive separation. But this also means relationships might become more superficial. A text message is not the same as a face-to-face conversation. People might communicate more, but connect less deeply. This is a tension we see in our world too. The same technology that enables connection also changes the nature of connection. Social hierarchies shift. In the old world, social status was visible and fixed. You could tell someone's class by their clothing, their accent, their education. With phones, some of these markers become less important. A slave with a phone has access to the same information as a senator. Knowledge becomes democratized. Archaeologists have found evidence of Roman social hierarchies. They discovered that clothing, housing, and education mark social status. A senator dressed differently than a commoner. A wealthy merchant lived differently than a poor farmer. These markers were visible and enforced. Historians have studied how social status worked in ancient Rome. They found that status was based on birth, wealth, and education. A person's class determined their opportunities, their rights, and their place in society. But with phones, some of these markers become less important. A slave with a phone has access to the same information as a senator. Knowledge becomes democratized. But phones might also create new hierarchies. Who has the latest apps? Who has the best network connection? Who can afford to keep their phone charged? Technology might create new forms of inequality, even as it reduces old ones. The same device that levels the playing field also creates new ways to differentiate. But phones might also create new hierarchies. Who has the latest apps? Who has the best network connection? Who can afford to keep their phone charged? Technology might create new forms of inequality, even as it reduces old ones. Culture and identity transform. In the Old World, local cultures developed independently. A Gaul and a Greek had different customs, different beliefs, different ways of life. With phones, cultures would mix more. People would see how others live. They would share ideas, stories, and traditions. Cultural boundaries would blur. Archaeologists have found evidence of cultural diversity in the Roman Empire. They discovered different customs, different languages, and different beliefs across regions. The empire was culturally diverse, because information could not spread fast enough to create uniformity. Each region developed its own identity. Historians have studied how cultures mixed in ancient Rome. They found that cultures influenced each other slowly, through trade, migration, and conquest. A Gaul might adopt some Roman customs. A Roman might adopt some Greek customs. But this mixing was slow and partial. Cultural boundaries remained strong. With phones, this changes. Cultures would mix faster. People would see how others live. They would share ideas, stories, and traditions. Cultural boundaries would blur. This could be enriching. People might adopt the best ideas from different cultures. But it could also be threatening. Traditional ways might disappear. Local identities might weaken. The empire might become more uniform but also less diverse. This could be enriching. People might adopt the best ideas from different cultures. But it could also be threatening. Traditional ways might disappear. local identities might weaken. The empire might become more uniform, but also less diverse. Religion would be affected too. In the Old World, religious ideas spread slowly. Different regions developed different practices. With phones, religious messages could spread instantly. A new religious movement could gain followers across the empire in weeks instead of years. Archaeologists have found evidence of religious diversity in the Roman Empire. They discovered temples to different gods, different rituals, and different beliefs. The empire was religiously diverse because information could not spread fast enough to create uniformity. Each region developed its own religious practices. Historians have studied how religions spread in ancient Rome. They found that new religions spread slowly, through missionaries, travelers, and trade. Christianity, for example, took centuries to spread across the empire. But with phones, religious messages could spread instantly. A new religious movement could gain followers across the empire in weeks, instead of years. This creates new possibilities and new challenges. Religious ideas could spread faster, reaching more people. But this speed might also lead to conflict. Different religious groups might compete more intensely. Traditional beliefs might be challenged more quickly. The religious landscape would become more dynamic, but also more contested. But this also means religious authorities would face new challenges. Heretical ideas could spread quickly. Traditional beliefs might be questioned. The religious landscape would become more dynamic, but also more contested. Historians have documented how religious authorities controlled information. They found that authorities often suppressed heretical ideas, but this suppression was slow. By the time they learned about a new idea, it might have already spread. With phones, this control would be much harder. Ideas would spread too fast to suppress. Archaeologists have found evidence of religious conflict. They discovered that different religious groups sometimes competed for followers. But this competition was slow. Ideas spread gradually, giving authorities time to respond. With phones, this time would disappear. Heretical ideas could spread instantly, challenging traditional beliefs before authorities could respond. This creates new challenges for religious authorities. They could not stop ideas from spreading, they could only respond, and responses might be too slow. The religious landscape would become more dynamic, but also more contested. New movements would rise faster. Traditional beliefs would face new challenges. The balance of religious power would shift. Entertainment and leisure change. In the Old World, entertainment was local. You went to the theater in your city. You listened to bards in your tavern. With phones, entertainment becomes portable. You could listen to music anywhere. You could read stories anywhere. You could play games anywhere. Archaeologists have found evidence of Roman entertainment. They discovered theaters, amphitheaters, and public spaces where people gathered for entertainment. These were local events. A play in Rome was not seen in Gaul. A song in Alexandria was not heard in Britannia. Entertainment was tied to place and time. Historians have studied how Romans spent their leisure time. They found that people gathered in public spaces for games, plays, and socializing. These gatherings were important for community building. But with phones, entertainment becomes portable. People could listen to music, read stories, and play games anywhere, anytime. Entertainment would no longer require gathering in public spaces. This changes how people spend time. In the Old World, people might gather in marketplaces, forums, and theaters. These gatherings built community, but with phones, people might spend more time alone, focused on their screens. Public life might decline. community bonds might weaken. The same technology that connects people across distances might disconnect them from their immediate communities. But phones might also change how people spend time. In the old world, people might gather in public spaces, marketplaces, forums, theaters. With phones, people might spend more time alone, focused on their screens. Public life might decline. Community bonds might weaken. Historians have documented the importance of public spaces in ancient Rome. They found that forums, marketplaces, and theaters were central to community life. People gathered there to socialize, trade, and participate in public life. These gatherings built social bonds and community identity. Archaeologists have found evidence of these public spaces. They discovered forums with shops, temples, and meeting areas. They found theaters where people gathered for entertainment. These spaces were designed to bring people together, but with phones, people might spend less time in these spaces. They might prefer private entertainment on their phones. This is a tension we see in our world. Technology connects us across distances, but might disconnect us from our immediate communities. Ancient Rome would face the same challenge. The same device that enables global connection might weaken local bonds. The empire would need to balance these competing effects. Privacy faces new challenges. In the old world, most communication was private. Letters were sealed, conversations were face-to-face. With phones, communication becomes digital, messages can be intercepted. The government might monitor communications, privacy becomes harder to maintain. But phones also enable private communication that was impossible before. You can message someone without others knowing. You can have secret conversations. Privacy changes in both directions, harder to maintain in some ways, easier in others. Misinformation and rumors spread faster. In the old world, false information spread slowly. There was time to verify facts. With phones, false information spreads instantly. The emperor is planning to raise taxes. A false message could cause panic before anyone could verify the truth. People would need to develop new skills, critical thinking, fact-checking, source verification, but not everyone would have these skills. Misinformation would be a constant problem. The digital divide creates new inequalities. Not everyone would get phones, not everyone would learn to use them. Not everyone would have reliable charging or network access. This would create new inequalities. Those with phones would have advantages. Those without would be left behind. The government might try to address this. Maybe they distribute phones to everyone. Maybe they build public charging stations. Maybe they provide training. But some people would still be excluded. Technology would create new forms of inequality, even as it reduced old ones. Phones would transform society in profound ways. They would revolutionize commerce, education, and family life. They would democratize knowledge but create new inequalities. They would connect people across distances but might disconnect them from local communities. They would spread culture and ideas but also misinformation and conflict. The changes would be complex, with both benefits and costs. Some people would gain, some would lose. Society would become more connected but also more complex. Would these changes make life better or worse? Would they create a more just society, or a more divided one? These are questions without easy answers. But they are questions worth asking, because they help us understand how technology shapes human experience, and how human experience shapes technology. We have explored a lot tonight. We have imagined smartphones arriving in ancient Rome. We have thought about how they would work. We have considered how they would change military strategy, governance, and society. What does this thought experiment teach us? Why does it matter? Technology is not neutral. The same smartphone that helps a general coordinate armies can also help rebels organize. The same network that connects families can also spread misinformation. Technology amplifies human intentions, both good and bad. It does not solve problems by itself. It just changes how problems manifest. Infrastructure matters. Smartphones would not work in ancient Rome without adaptations. Solar panels, hand cranks, mesh networks, relay stations. Technology needs infrastructure to function. But infrastructure also shapes how technology is used. The Roman road network, built for couriers, becomes the backbone for digital communication. Old systems enable new possibilities. Communication speed changes everything. When messages take weeks, you plan differently. You give people independence. You accept delays. When messages take seconds, you can micromanage. You expect instant responses. You lose patience with delays. Speed changes not just what is possible, but how people think and behave. Information is power. In the old world, information was controlled by elites. With phones, information spreads. Knowledge becomes accessible. But this also means elites lose some control. Power shifts. New groups gain influence. Technology redistributes power, even as it creates new forms of power. Technology creates both opportunities and vulnerabilities. Better communication enables better coordination. But it also creates new attack surfaces. Encrypted messages protect privacy, but also enable secrecy. Every advantage comes with a cost. Every solution creates new problems. We live in an age of instant communication. We have smartphones, the internet, social media. We face many of the same challenges ancient Rome would have faced. Misinformation spreads quickly. Privacy is hard to maintain. Power is redistributed. Society is transformed. By imagining how smartphones would change ancient Rome, we gain perspective on how they have changed our world. We see patterns. We recognize trade-offs. We understand that technology is not magic. It is a tool. And like all tools, it can be used well or poorly. This thought experiment is not really about ancient Rome. It is about us. It is about understanding how technology shapes human experience, how communication changes society, how speed transforms relationships, how information redistributes power. When we imagine Romans using smartphones, we are really asking, what does it mean to be human in an age of instant communication? How do we maintain connection when everything moves fast? How do we preserve privacy when everything is connected? How do we use technology wisely when it changes so quickly? These are questions without easy answers. But they are questions worth asking, because the future will bring new technologies, new ways of communicating, new ways of connecting. If we understand how technology has shaped the past, we can better navigate how it will shape the future. What have we learned? Technology is powerful, but not magic. Infrastructure enables innovation. Speed changes behavior. Information redistributes power. Every advantage has a cost. The future is uncertain, but understanding the past helps us prepare. Technology does not determine our future. People do. How we use technology matters more than what technology we have. Ancient Rome with smartphones would face challenges, but also opportunities. The outcome would depend not on the technology itself, but on how Romans chose to use it. The same is true for us. We have powerful communication technology. How we use it will shape our future. Will we use it to connect or to divide? To inform or to mislead? To empower or to control? These are choices we make every day. The thought experiment ends, but the questions remain. What does it mean to live in an age of instant communication? How do we use technology wisely? How do we preserve what matters while embracing what helps? These are questions for all of us, whether we live in ancient Rome or modern times. We have reached the end of our journey. We started with a simple question. What if every Roman citizen had a smartphone? We explored how they would work, how they would change military strategy, governance and society. We thought about power, infrastructure, speed and information. We connected ancient Rome to our modern world. This was a thought experiment, a way to explore big ideas through imagination. The real value is not in predicting what would have happened, but in understanding how technology shapes human experience, how communication changes society, how we can use technology wisely. Thank you for joining us on this journey. Thank you for thinking along with us. Thank you for exploring the what-ifs and the why-nots. Science is not just about facts. It is about curiosity, about imagination, about asking questions that have no easy answers. Until next time, keep wondering. Keep questioning, keep exploring. I am Sleepy, and this was your science story for today. Sweet dreams. And may your thoughts be as vast as the Roman Empire, and as connected as a mesh network spanning continents.